And so we've been tracking Jonah in this journey, and I've loved this series because it's really relatable to me and in my life and where I find myself, and I hope it has been relatable to you. And we've watched Jonah as he's given these instructions, and he doesn't follow through with them. He kind of goes his own way. He considers this as an interruption in his life, and he heads his own direction. It's not really working out for him, so he takes the steps necessary to kind of come back to square one and to follow through with the original plan that God led him to. And we find that he heads to Nineveh. He put one foot in front of the other to get there, and here we are today as we find him following through with the calling that God placed on his life. And that's not always easy, right? Following through with those things that God has led us to do. I always find that God has, he gives me things in my life that I don't feel like I have the ability to accomplish. I mean, this is the way it works in my life. And I remember when I was 22 and I'm pastoring a church in New York, and I'm way too young to be pastoring a whole church, and I don't really know what I'm doing. And that somehow, some way, God just provides, and he uses this guy like me at 22 to do something great for his kingdom. And under that ministry, the church grew. Or I can remember when we had our first child, Brayson. I remember at the hospital, the nurse comes in, and she looks at Emily and I, and she's like, "Congratulations, you guys are released. You guys can go home." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And she's like, "Well, you can take your son and you can head home." And I'm like, "What do you mean take our son and go home? You're trusting me with a child? Like, this is a human being. I can't have this responsibility." And then you press into it and you become like this dad, and you realize, you know what? This is amazing. I don't have the ability on my own, but God can accomplish this thing through me. And I really think that is how God works. He calls us to do these things, and if we follow through in obedience to do them, when it's out of our wheelhouse or we don't really have the abilities to maybe accomplish those things on our own, what it does is it gives God the credit that he deserves in the midst of that. And so when God places something in your life, when he tells you to do something, how do you follow through with what God has called you to do? How do you follow through with what God has called you to do? And I think we really need to answer that, because I think Jonah is struggling with that same thing. And today we want to give some practical insights into that, into following through with those plans that he's led you to do, even if you don't feel like you're capable of doing those things. And so God has led Jonah to the city of Nineveh. Now, the city of Nineveh at the time is the biggest, strongest, it's one of the most powerful cities in the world, and he leads Jonah to this city. In fact, the Bible records that it takes 3 days to walk through this city because it's so big. It's known for its population, has about 600,000 inhabitants who live there. And at the time, that's massive, right? And so he goes into the city. It's not only known for its population base, it's also known for being a very evil, very corrupt. It's a brutal and a violent place. In fact, a lot of people, when they had to get to a destination on the other side of Nineveh, they would take the time to walk all the way around it. They wouldn't go through it because the thing is terrifying. People didn't even want to be associated with Nineveh because it's so bad. It's so evil. And yet this is where God tells Jonah to go. I imagine Jonah feels a lot like I do. Like, how do you expect me to do this? This 600,000 people, they're totally evil, they're totally corrupt, they're brutal, they're violent. How do you expect me to follow through with this huge plan that you've called me to, this huge task that you're leading me to? But instead of grumbling over the insurmountable odds, Jonah presses forward. And he moves forward in immediate obedience to God's commission. In fact, we find out what happens here in Jonah chapter 3, verse 4. Here's what it reads. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city. So we found out that it's 3 days it takes to walk through that city. About 1 day into that journey, He proclaims, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. You can imagine him kind of shouting this throughout the city. This is the proclamation that God wanted him to go to Nineveh to say. And so he's following through on those plans. And when you follow through, when you try to fulfill the calling that God has placed on you, there's a few real things, important things we need to understand in following through on God's calling, right? I think the first one is this. We really need to understand and know that we are set up to win. When God calls us to do something, we're set up to win. He set it up for us, right? He doesn't call us to do something and then not have the ability to accomplish it. So this summer, my kids love to go to garage sales and fill our house with extra junk, all right? Let's be honest. And so they go to the garage sale, they pick up, my oldest son picks up this, it's like an automatic hockey ball passer. And so what it is, he bought this thing, I think it was $5, and you put these hockey balls in the top, and you load it full of hockey balls, and then you put batteries in this thing, and it automatically shoots out these balls. And so we set this thing up. He's in the driveway. We got the hockey net. He's got his hockey stick. He's ready to rock. We put the balls in. We press the on button. It shoots out the first ball, and it's like a lightning bolt. He's not ready for it because he's never had this before. It shoots out. He winds up, and he doesn't even swing because it goes so fast, and it just goes right by him, okay? And then before he's even ready for the second one, it launches out immediately, and he's not ready for that one. And the third one he strikes out on, and then the fourth and the fifth, he doesn't connect with any of them. And this first experience with the ball thrower, he's frustrated. He doesn't even want to do this anymore. He bought this thing. He spent his own money on it. Now he doesn't even want to play with it, right? And he goes off and does his own thing. Well, when he goes off, I take a look at that thing. And it's a very easy fix. You see, what I wanted to do is slow that thing down so that he has the opportunity to connect with the ball. I wanted to tinker with that thing so that the next time he was up for the slap shot, he was able to connect right away with the ball that came his way. Now, I am totally stunned at the situation in Nineveh. I am. It's unmatched. I mean, you consider how quickly the effects of Jonah's obedience, this message that he's proclaiming one day into walking into Nineveh, you consider that. It blows your mind what is happening here. And I'm sure Jonah is amazed at what is taking place as well. After one day on the job, conviction spreads like wildfire. In fact, people one day in, they totally change from their ways. I mean, everyone. They totally change direction, and conviction is so very, very deep. In fact, I have never heard anything like this before. I've never heard of something spreading like that, a message so simple taking effect. In fact, historians believe that this is the single greatest revival in all of human history. In Nineveh, this event, this message that Jonah proclaims, single greatest revival in all of human history. Which gets me wondering, how is that possible? How is that possible? I have preached a lot of messages. I've shared a lot of teachings that, in my mind, seem more substantial than simply Jonah's message. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. And yet Jonah, when he shares this message, it's amazing the fruit that comes because of it, the change that happens. I can't imagine this happening where we live. I can't imagine going to the local arena and saying, hey, 40 more days and this town's going to be overthrown. I mean, no one's going to respond to that message. And yet somehow this takes place in Nineveh after such a simple event. Well, why did this happen? Can we understand it a little better? I think we really need to go to the history books and get a lesson in history to understand why this change happened so quickly. And so check this out. In 765 BC, and again in 759 BC, we see two very, very bad plagues that ravage the people of Nineveh. And so you can imagine disease and illness and sickness, it spreads like wildfire throughout the city of about 600,000 people. And people are witnessing their kids dying. People are witnessing their parents, their husbands, their wives. They're witnessing their neighbors. People are dying all over the place because of these plagues that ravage the city of Nineveh. Not only that, but we see in 763 BC, there's a total eclipse of the sun. Now, in those days, when that would happen, You can imagine, like, people in the middle of the day, they see the sun covered up and it goes dark, and they're wondering, like, what is this? This is absolutely supernatural event that's taking place. And when we understand what history has to say about what Nineveh has gone through to get to this point, we get a little bit more of an understanding how they might have been softened. Their hearts might have been massaged, if you will, a little bit. That God had allowed these events to soften the heart of the Nineveh, to set them up for a win. To set Jonah up for a win as he walked into this city with a very simple yet profound message. See, God had gone to Nineveh before Jonah ever arrived to tinker with the circumstances to set him up for a win. I love how Deuteronomy puts it in chapter 31, verse 8. It reads like this: "The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." See, the thing we really need to hone in on here is that when God leads you to do something, when he calls you to do something, he's already in Nineveh. He's already setting this thing up for you. If he's called you to, he's ready for the win. And he's already there before you. And you got to really understand that when you're trying to fulfill God's calling on your life or what he's called you to do, which leads me to point number 2. Know that God gives the wildest of dreams. The wildest of dreams. He does. All his dreams are so crazy, so wild, so far-fetched that it can only be him if they're realized, right? Now, a couple weeks ago, you might have heard in down south, or neighbors to the south, they had a lottery, and the jackpot of that lottery kept climbing and climbing and climbing. Let's check out this news report that we pulled in this week.
Good morning, Gio.
Yeah, with a B, Eva. Good morning. Yeah, we're now talking about an unprecedented all-time world record. That incredible new jackpot is up for grabs. And if you thought there was lotto fever this week, get ready for the days ahead. This morning, millions across America are now eyeing a prize of a lifetime.
Okay, $4. Let's go.
That jaw-dropping Mega Millions jackpot now at over $1 billion. No winners last night.
553, 23, 15, 70, the gold Mega Mile is 7.
Your odds of winning the game's largest prize, 1 in 302 million. But this statistic hasn't deterred lottery hopefuls from chasing their fiscal fantasies.
Yeah, $1.6 billion. $1.6 billion, right? People signing up for this lottery, they'd be happy on typical lottery to win like $1 million. That would be astronomical. Wow, I can't believe I got $1 million from only playing the lottery for 30 years straight, right? I can't believe I got $1 million, but I got $1.6 billion. It exceeds their expectations. And I guess my question for you is, what are your wildest dreams? Is it your wildest dream to win $1.6 billion? Is it your wildest dream to own a Harley? Is it what is your wildest dream? Because could it be that God has even greater dreams for you? And let's just take a moment here and quietly just think and reflect on that. Is this about a divine intervention or an interruption? See, the divine intervention dream here, the one that's been on your mind, maybe possibly for the last several weeks as we've honed in on this series in Jonah's life, maybe God is stirring your heart. Maybe he's planted a seed deep inside of you to what he's calling you to do, the place that he'd have you go, the place he'd have you serve, the place that he'd have you represent his name. And as we've walked through Jonah, what would be the most phenomenal outcome of that seed that he planted in you? What would be the thing that he absolutely would blow your mind if it ended up happening through what he's led you to do? See, when Jonah went reluctantly, he still goes to Nineveh. He still follows through with what God called him to do. And he knew that God was eager to offer mercy to the people of Nineveh, but I would suppose that he did not expect this type of result when he went. The response that his message got is absolutely amazing here. Not only did the people just respond in one day, but check out to the extent their response went to, okay? Look at chapter 3, verse 5. It reads like this: "The Ninevites believed God. a fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. Now that's one thing, but if we keep going in verse 6 to 8, it gets more extreme, their response from this simple message. It says this: when Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, he took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds of flocks, taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. But let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. I mean, it's to really start looking at this and understanding this a little better. You see, when Jonah decided to walk in obedience to what God called him to do, the result was a harvest that is phenomenal. The result is a harvest that is unprecedented. The result of this is beyond Jonah's wildest dreams that he could have accomplished on his own. See, not just one person or a handful of people or a couple hundred people came to God and turned the other way and asked for forgiveness and took these steps with a fast. It says every citizen of Nineveh, from the greatest to the least, from the oldest to the youngest, men and women. It actually even goes so far, they are so convicted that it even goes so far that the animals are wearing sackcloth. Imagine those of you who have dogs or, heaven forbid, cats. They're covered in sackcloth, and you're making your animals fast as well. Can you imagine that? They're walking around like everyone's kind of dressed. It's ridiculous. But the conviction is so great that every single citizen, every single animal, everyone in all of Nineveh turns. Your wildest dreams, listen. I think that the truth we learn from this is that our wildest dreams are connected to our obedience in following through what God has called us to do. And whatever your wildest dream is, on maybe a personal or a selfish type of dream, I'm telling you, your obedience to what God has called you to do, that is where the most phenomenal, far-fetched, crazy, wildest dreams, it's where they're realized in the obedience to God. Which leads me to point number 3. How do you follow through with God, what God's leading you to do? You know that God relents. You know that God relents. And that sounds like a weird thing, right? Because what we understand, that word relent really means to change. Know that God changes. I'm just thinking, like, what do you mean by God? What do we mean by God changes? I thought God didn't change. That's what I understand of God. He's unchanging. He doesn't change. He's an unchanging God. And so if we recap the story of Jonah, Jonah is given this message. He decides not to follow through with what God's called him to do. And then he repents. And then he starts at square one. Then he decides, you know what? I am going to follow through with what God calls me to do. He goes to Nineveh, he proclaims this message, and we find out that God says, I'm going to destroy the people of Nineveh. I'm going to destroy this city. In 40 days, I'm going to destroy them. That is God's plan. And yet, in chapter 3, verse 10, here's what we read. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented, so he changed, and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. And so he was planning for one thing, and then he doesn't do it. And in my mind, it sounds like God is changing here. But if we take a deeper look, we see something a little bit different. You see, we are human beings, and God is not. We have a finite language with words that can't fully describe God, especially in the English language. But when we take a quicker look, a more detailed look rather, on this word relent, and we kind of look at it in the Hebrew, we find this word described as nachum. And that word really means to take pity on, to be moved to pity. See, when we take a closer look here, what we're really seeing, what it implies, is that God is not changing here. He's not changing at all. What it implies is that he's chosen a response to the Ninevites who have changed. And so what we could understand is this: God relenting is actually God responding. He's responding to the change that the Ninevites had in their heart. And I think that's important for us to really understand as well, because when you live in obedience, it allows God to respond. It allows him to. If you're not living in obedience, how can God respond into your life? How can the wildest, crazy, phenomenal dreams, how can they be realized if you're not living in obedience? So God relenting equals God responding, which leads us to the final chapter of this book. Now, some of you, you've followed through, you've been good students, you've read the book of Jonah like I had asked you to in the first week. I said, just read these 4 chapters, and you did that. And what you'll find is when you read chapter 4 in the book of Jonah, if you're like me, it kind of frustrates you to see the ending here, because to me, what it was like is like, you ever go to those movies and you're sitting in the theater, you paid money to go see those movies, and it's supposed to be this great movie, and then it ends, and it's not resolved. It ends and it's unresolved. It ends and you're like, what is going on here? The screens fade to black and the credits start rolling, and you're at the edge of your seat waiting for the next thing to happen. It's like, that is it? Do I have to make the ending myself here? Like, I don't understand what's going on. That's kind of the way that chapter 4 ends. And as you read chapter 4, as you kind of see Jonah's life, he really reacts to fulfilling God's calling on his life much in the same way that we do. I kind of find that encouraging, right? I mean, he's struggling. He's thick-headed at the beginning. He doesn't do what God asks. Then he does do what God asks. And then even after he follows through with what God asks, he's still struggling. He's human, just like we are. He struggles in following through with what God has led him to do. And at the end, the screen fades to black, and we don't know the end result for Jonah. We don't know what he does in the rest of his story, in the rest of his life. And while at the beginning I found that frustrating, why would they leave us like that? Why would this end like that? It's frustrating when you first read it, and then when you start to think about it, it's kind of encouraging. Because we don't really need to be worried about the ending of Jonah's story. What we need to be worried about is the ending to ours. And God asks us, how are you going to end this story in your life? See, as we've journeyed through this series, we found out that Jonah is more and more relatable than we ever thought. And the story is left open-ended because it's ours to tell. Will we follow through with obedience? Will we allow a God who pursued in the same way he pursued Jonah, in the same way he forgave Jonah, in the same way he equipped Jonah, in the same way that he called Jonah, in the same way he looked after Jonah, and he looks after us, and he calls us, and he equips us. He says, are you going to fulfill and follow through with the end of the story? The choice is up to you. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, you have led us and called us to great things. And some of the most wild, crazy, phenomenal outcomes to our dreams rely on our obedience to you. So our obedience to you, God, allows you to respond. And you are God and we are not, and we long for your response in our lives. We long to tell the story that you want to tell through us. And so, Father, may we learn from Jonah in his life. May we press on to the calling that you've placed on us. May we fulfill full well in obedience what you've led us to do. God, we pray these things in Jesus' name.